Bruxelles,
Paris, Madrid.
Hi, welcome back. I'm Hermine. The European Union is known for its high quality of life and strong welfare systems, but it is losing its competitive edge in the global economy. That's to say, its ability to thrive in the global marketplace. Europe's traditional model of open markets and fair competition is under pressure from China's state-backed industries and the United States protectionist Make America Great Again or MAGA policies. At the same time, Europe has faced major challenges including the pandemic, the loss of cheap Russian energy, and the growing need to invest in defense. As a result, Europe is falling behind the US and China in global competitiveness. Ekaterina Rojak, a member of Lithuania's parliament, explains why.
In recent decades, we have seen that Europe's competitiveness has indeed declined, and the European Union's share of global industry has shrunk from around 17% of GDP before the financial crisis to 14%. And the European Commission's aim to bring it back towards the 20% target is entirely understandable.
Europe's declining competitiveness also puts its social model at risk, as a weaker economy means less funding for public services and welfare. The problem is widely recognized, prompting a major political shift in Brussels. In early 2025, the EU responded by launching the Competitiveness Compass. This is a strategy to boost innovation, combine climate action with economic growth, and strengthen Europe's security by reducing its reliance on other countries. With the floodgates open and first solutions being put into action, the question remains how to achieve all of that and what compromises we'll have to make. In the next 3 episodes, we will examine some of these issues. We will look at the ideas emerging from Brussels to boost the bloc's competitiveness, ask whether green and climate policies are compatible with competitiveness, and explore whether the EU can manage with less immigration while maintaining an active workforce and a functioning welfare state. A number of reports have given the EU food for thought on this matter, most famously Mario Draghi's 2024 report. It says that EU industries should become more productive to stay competitive. Put simply, it's about getting more output of the same or fewer resources, such as labor, money, and materials. But Europe faces several obstacles, including high energy costs, fragmented capital markets, slow innovation, excessive red tape, reliance on foreign suppliers, and a shortage of skilled workers. That's a long list. So how can the EU strengthen key industries while making businesses more competitive? Let's start with what might be called the low-hanging fruit, red tape and costly EU rules. Calls for simplifying the rules have been particularly vocal, rightly or wrongly, in areas where the EU is falling behind its rivals, like artificial intelligence, biotechnology, digital services, and financial technologies. In early 2025, the European Commission introduced a so-called omnibus package to reduce paperwork and simplify rules. Its goal is to cut administrative burdens by 25% for businesses and 35% for small and medium-sized enterprises. MEP Maria Grapini, a Romanian member of the European Parliament Socialists and Democrats group, supports the initiative.
We have this omnibus initiative, which involves taking every directive and regulation and simplifying it, precisely so that we no longer have these high costs. Of course, there's also the question of whether this simplification actually constitutes deregulation. What we really need to do is simplify, because for micro, small and medium-sized enterprises, the administrative burden is extremely high, and the cost of it pushes them beyond the limits of competitiveness.
As Grapini notes, some consumer groups and civil society organizations see the initiative as deregulation, arguing that cutting rules, especially in the digital and AI sectors, could weaken consumer protections, accountability and oversight. These concerns were also raised in a report commissioned by the European Parliament itself. Another way to support European industry is to speed up the approval of business permits. A new plan has been tabled this year with the idea to protect and support key industrial sectors and increase manufacturing's share of European GDP up to 20% by 2035 from the 14% it represents today. The plan also brings in a single Made in Europe rule, meaning that when governments spend public money, they now have to favour EU-origin suppliers for green tech and core infrastructure. This, they hope, should help to keep the money and well-paid jobs in Europe. Maeve Rutte, the Commission's Director General for the Internal Market, Industry, Entrepreneurship and SMEs, elaborates on this.
Under the idea of giving preference to Europe, several objectives come together. On the one hand, it is about reducing vulnerabilities. On the other, it's about creating opportunities for European industry and jobs. A third aspect, which is discussed less often, is consumer protection and the protection of intellectual property.
Made in Europe is at the heart of plans to revive industry, keep green tech in Europe, and ramp up strategic production. You will find similar types of preferences in renewable energy, power grids, chips and critical raw material, and even in defense production. These policies mark a major shift. Europe is moving away from focusing only on open markets and low prices towards making its economy more secure. However, free trade countries like Germany worry that this approach could appear protectionist and trigger retaliation, putting exports, especially cars, at risk. But they could also have a much more far-reaching impact than this, warns Götz Dürmann, the managing director of the East Westphalia Chamber of Commerce and Industry in Bielefeld, Germany.
The scope of intervention should be strictly limited to certain critical key sectors. It would be problematic if the entire economy were to become inefficient through excessive intervention. The EU should not be aiming for self-sufficiency, in other words, complete self-reliance. Instead, the aim should be to reduce strategic dependencies while maintaining a fundamental openness to international trade.
But with the EU recently signing more free trade agreements based on mutual openness, it might be too soon to call the bloc protectionist. EU countries relay industry's frustration with the barriers holding back growth and competitiveness. But they also need to take responsibility for not dealing with the issue of how divided up the European system is. Above all, the EU's internal market, the single market, remains incomplete, making it harder for business to grow across borders. This is estimated to cost the European economy between 300 and 500 billion euros in GDP every year. Leszezar Bogdanov, chief economist at the Institute for Market Economics in Bulgaria, points out that many member states have failed to fulfill their obligations in this regard.
Each country imposes its own national requirements, which are very often different, and not just for services, but also for goods. In fact, quite a few countries are periodically subject to disciplinary proceedings for restricting the functioning of the single market. In this respect, too, we have failed to do our homework. So before we look to the US for tech giants, or to China and other Asian countries for industrial giants, we must ask ourselves what is hindering the growth of companies in Europe. One of the obstacles is the fragmentation of the single market and the barriers being erected. Ultimately, we have 27 national markets instead of one large common European market.
The single market remains fragmented in key areas such as finance, digital services and energy. This limits the growth of European companies, with many startups moving to the US to access more capital and a larger market. On a side note, it's a bit ironic that countries like Germany worry so much about putting up new barriers to the rest of the world when they don't have a great track record on tearing down the barriers inside Europe. In 2026, EU institutions have responded with the One Europe, One Market plan, aimed, among others, at completing the single market. The goal is to implement these changes by the end of 2027. And that's tomorrow. Europe is also falling behind in digital and technology, holding back productivity. While the EU produces world-class research, it struggles to turn innovation into successful global products and companies. Economist Panagiotis Petrakis warns that smaller European industries risk being left out of key value chain and falling further behind.
If economies, especially weaker ones like Greece's, fail to integrate into the future value chains that will emerge around the world, I'm talking about the next wave of technology, AI, new pharmaceuticals, and so on, we will once again find ourselves on the outside, and this time it will be even more painful than in the past.
To tackle fragmentation, the EU has proposed new measures, including a one-stop shop, allowing businesses to create a European company within 48 hours for under €100. The aim is to make it easier for companies to start and grow across the EU. However, some member states remain hesitant to give Brussels more power to harmonize corporate rules. To bridge the innovation gap, the EU needs a massive amount of investment, enough to compete with the deep pools of capital provided by private equity in the US or state-subsidized industrial funds in China. And Lithuanian MP Rojak cautions against inaction, which she believes will have dire consequences for the EU economy.
We are not choosing between openness and protectionism. We are choosing whether Europe will be a technology creator or a consumer. The US is very actively subsidizing industry. China is supporting strategic technologies. And European industry is now paying the price of neglect, as this period of inaction is indeed hitting the entire sector quite hard. If Europe does not invest in its industry and in attracting new capital, it risks becoming a technology museum rather than a technology leader.
In late 2025, Commission President Ursula von der Leyen announced that the EU would mobilize more than €1 trillion for innovation, clean technology and security under the Competitiveness Compass. However, this is a one-off amount. Mario Draghi argues that Europe needs around €750 billion in additional investment every year, around 5% of EU GDP, to keep pace with the US and China. Some estimates now put the figure even higher, at around €1.2 trillion annually. To close this gap, Draghi has called for joint EU debt to fund common European projects. But this idea has faced opposition from more financially cautious countries such as Germany and the Netherlands. Public money alone will not be enough. Most investment in the US and UK comes from private markets. However, Europe's capital markets also remain fragmented, with different national rules on taxes, pensions, insolvency and corporate governance, making cross-border investment difficult, as Carlos Costa, former governor of the Bank of Portugal, explains.
There are 27 supervisory bodies and 27 markets. There are 27 legal frameworks, 27 insolvency laws, and 27 procedures for resolving insolvency-related issues. In practice, investors do not operate within the European Union in the same way that an American investor operates within the United States.
A fully fledged capital markets union is therefore an essential step towards competitiveness, says Costa.
This implies two things: the ability to place capital where it is most efficient, regardless of the country where those opportunities arise. And it also implies guarantees for those who invest capital for that purpose. The fact is that member states have been very protective of their specific market organization, their rules and even their authorities, and have not been willing to create a single stock exchange, a single market authority, a single insolvency regime, or a single jurisdiction. And what the EU has observed is that this limits its capacity for investment and innovation.
The European Commission and Parliament are actively pushing ahead with the banking union project, but financial centres such as Ireland, Luxembourg and Malta, along with a few other countries, are resisting, keen to preserve their national legislation. So where does that leave us? Brussels has got the reforms moving and is clearly doing what it can on the political side. But is that enough on the economic side? Until the member states are willing to give up their national vetoes, join up their financial markets and borrow money together, the way the EU is built will keep acting as a handbrake, slowing down the very competitiveness it's trying to boost. In our next episode, we will look at one of the key tensions swirling around this competitiveness agenda, namely how it fits the EU's carbon-neutral agenda. So stay tuned. My team of journalists have got the clips from all over Europe. Cheers, everyone. Augustia Ginio Radias, Stefan at Radio Romagna, Mart at Cucu Radio, Sina at AMS, Eleonora at BNR, Sky's Mariana and Nikos, Alejandra and Pedro at Hnashinsa, Jean-Claude at Luxembourg's Radio 100.7, and Wojciech from the Europeans podcast. Monica edited this episode.